So this is actually going to be a talk about the way Buddhist tradition talks about and uses words to point into the reality that we all know very, very well, because it is our life. It's the life. Our life is a life of awareness, and so it's going to be all about this quality that is that you are participating in, if that's the right word, right now, by listening to what I'm about to say. If you want to do that. The question arises: why would one want to know? Why would you want to know what awareness is? I understand that it's not necessarily a question that you have. What is awareness? But if you really did want to know what awareness is, what kind of answer could you expect to have? Is it even a question we can expect to have a useful answer to? And I think, in a sense, no. We can't expect to have a really coherent answer, because no description in words can capture what awareness is. I don't think. I think the best kind of answer would be for each of us individually to look into the awareness that's there in this particular moment, and feel it, examine it, open up to it, explore it when you've opened up to it, and play with it, as we do every minute of our lives. But sometimes you look at it a bit more closely. So I think a great practice for all Dharma practitioners of all kinds is to do this often. Yeah, do it often. Just look at what particular awareness is arising right now and ask, what is this? What is this? So I think that's the best kind of practice, really. But anyway, I've been asked to talk about this, or the talk evolved out of the need to give a talk. So I'm going to explore in particular and in words what the Buddhist tradition, in my understanding and experience, has to say regarding awareness. Speak, please check with your current experience as much as you can, because that's where everything I'm about to tell you, that's where it all happens. We all have to use abstract symbols to communicate. But in this topic of awareness, there is nothing whatsoever that is abstract. So it's hard to talk about. For some reason, I was looking at the Upanishadic tradition when the idea of this talk arose. And in that tradition, it looks into this question in a very interesting way. In the oldest of the Upanishads, I don't know how to actually say what these Upanishads are. They're scriptures, and they originate from India. They're older than Buddhism. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the question is, where does our light come from? Where does the light come from that lights up our existence? I think that's the gist of the question. And the guy says, yeah, come on, it's from the sun. The light comes from the sun. But then the person in the scripture says, well, okay, how do we manage when there's no sun? When it's night time? The guy says, okay, you've got the moon. The other person says, well, yeah, but sometimes there's no moon either. What do you do then? The answer is, you make a fire. Okay, so the fire goes out. It's pitch dark. Well, you hear a voice. A voice tells you, gives you some kind of bearings on your experience, even though it's pitch dark. Okay, all right, but the voice. What about when the voice isn't there, and there isn't any more? What then? What then? When you've got to a point where sensory input is pretty much zero. What then? How do you get your bearings as in your existence? And the answer given in the scripture, well, you've got yourself. You've got yourself. This is what gives us some kind of a bearing, some kind of an anchor. This is the Upanishadic tradition. And according to that tradition, that is where it all comes from. That is what lights up our existence. The self is what illuminates, that brings awareness. I find this very interesting because it's an important view for the Upanishadic tradition. It's not the Buddhist view. It's not the Buddhist view, but still it's one that goes very deep for most of humanity. And often, I reckon, for us as well, you know, on the whole, it's very understandable. Buddhism doesn't question that experience of self, but it does question the explanation and the view that there actually is something real and permanent called the self. And it's the same with the question of, say, God. Say the Christian or typical Christian view of God. Buddhists feel that the experience is completely valid. It's completely valid to feel that things are like that. It's the attribution, God, that is not valid. It's just the way of talking about it, the way of explaining the basic reality that we find ourselves in. I mean, perhaps this is all a little bit beside the point, because I don't think this particular Upanishad, whose name I can't pronounce, I don't think it seeks to answer the question, what is awareness? It just gives a sense of that illuminating quality. And it seems to propose that it comes from the self. This sense of being a self. But, you know, we could also ask, you know, what is that? What is that experience? What is it? Is it something? The Upanishad does go into that question, but it's answered in terms of other equally abstract concepts. For example, the self is God, or the self is pure being, or maybe the self is awareness. These are so heady, abstract, difficult to grasp words because you can't really find out what they're talking about. I think what we need to do to get into this question is come right down out of this abstraction, come down into our experience. And we find out more about awareness from our knees, our feet, the sensations in our bellies, and the feelings in our hearts. And we find out about it through bringing mindfulness to all our experience. That's how it works. Certainly from the Buddhist perspective, this is what the Buddhist attitude is. It comes from looking directly at your experience. So the classic teaching about awareness is the Satipatthana Sutta, famous Satipatthana Sutta. The great teaching about mindfulness. And this talks about becoming increasingly mindful, which means more aware or conscious of sensations, feelings, thoughts, and motivations. But it does not use the concept awareness as an abstract, unless it's referring to one of the senses. Awareness in Buddhism is always a relationship. It's about being aware of this, being aware of that. So you have some awareness of me. You have some awareness of whatever thoughts are going through your head. You have some awareness of the space we're in, etc. That is awareness. And for Buddhism, awareness or consciousness, we can use that word pretty much having the same meaning. It's a relationship between a subject and an object. It's what happens when an object of some kind shows up in any field of our perception. Something is seen, for example, or something is remembered. So awareness is always awareness of something. It's not a thing separate from anything else. Buddhism is interested in how perceptions arise, because when you actually pay attention and see how it happens, that's a special experience. Paying attention to something that simple is something we pretty much never do. And normally people aren't able to do it because they don't have the subtlety of awareness or the concentration or the interest, definitely the interest, or the time. Or they don't feel they have these things. But actually it's quite accessible to anyone who realizes that it is interesting. And paying attention to the detail of how things arise and pass away, how things rise into experience and pass out of experience, actually doing this really teaches you something. It'll really teach you something if you do that. When you really look, there is so much that is happening. There's a sense of some kind of a person. There is a body and a mind. And there is awareness that today's body and mind have arisen out of a whole range of causes. All of these causes are waiting to be explored in many, many different ways. It's so rich. You have this range of conditioning and present physical and emotional experience. And this is what we call, in a very general kind of way, myself. Out of birth, being born, out of a particular social situation, out of so many conditions, out of so much history, comes this present day person, me, now. And it comes into the world. There's a body with its amazing sense organs, which work in all kinds of ways, sometimes clearly, sometimes distortedly. And then the sights and the smells and the sounds and the touches and the ideas, they pour into these organs. This is what has always been happening in our lives. This has characterized our lives since before we were born. And for each day, each moment, this is how the world arises. And for Buddhism, indeed, at least from practice point of view, that is the world. That is the world. Because for us, the world arises where the senses and the sense organs meet. The Buddha called it the all. You know, he might as well have called it the everything. It's the all. Ear, eye, nose, tongue, body, mind, taking in sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and perceptions, mental perceptions. And outside this meeting place, there is no experience. And at this meeting place, we get 6 awarenesses, 6 consciousnesses. The Sanskrit term is vijnana, Vijnana, vijnana. There's eye consciousness, there's ear consciousness, there's nose consciousness, and so on. Or more simply, seeing, hearing, smelling, etc. It's important to understand that these awarenesses, these consciousnesses, are different every time. Each moment of eye awareness is different. I'm going to be stating the obvious a lot in this talk, but it's the obvious things, when you look at them, that are important. There is no seeing in the abstract, because moments of seeing are different every time. And also, they're generated differently every time, through a very wide range of different conditions, which are also different every time. The sights we see are changing, but also, in tiny ways, so are the eyes that are seeing. The apparatus that is taking it in is changing every moment. Sounds are changing, but so are the ears and the apparatus that comes into play with the ear consciousness, and so on. There is nothing in here that is stable, fixed, and permanent. So this is the nature of awareness in the Buddhist view. Sangharakshita, he talks in terms of levels of consciousness or awareness. There's simple consciousness, there's self-consciousness, and there's some kind of universal consciousness, or he calls it transcendental consciousness. And what we've been talking about so far has been simple consciousness. It's just hearing. There's a sound. As far as we can tell, plants and most animals only have simple consciousness. And the term refers to a whole range of kinds and degrees of awareness or responsiveness. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about animals and plants. We can see that a tree responds intimately to its immediate environment. It's a very intimate relationship. But it's hard to know if there's any kind of self-awareness in that thing we call a tree, in that phenomenon we call a tree. And if there is, what form it takes, we just don't know. But it's not easy to see that self-aware quality in other human beings either, very often. But we do have it ourselves quite a lot. So we know what we're talking about. At least we can get some kind of handle on this topic of self-awareness. We all become self-aware at a certain point in our lives. You might think back and think, can you remember an incident from your childhood where you suddenly realised that you were there, as it were? I've got a few memories like that. I think we often lose it, and we often regain it. It just comes and goes. And it's also something that can be cultivated. I think mindfulness practice, satipatthana practice, develops self-awareness in all kinds of ways. Though, paradoxically, the self-awareness that's cultivated doesn't involve believing that you have an actual self. That's not necessary. Indeed, as you practice mindfulness, that belief gets, in my experience, more diluted, because more and more you realise that your experience consists entirely of changing moments. Indeed, that's how the third level, the level of transcendental awareness, comes about. But we're not ready to talk about that. Not quite, anyway. There's still a lot to say about this so-called self-awareness. Or we could maybe also use the term reflexive awareness. In the human realm, in our world, as it were, we have that kind of awareness most of the time. It's the normal way we experience our world. There's an awareness that things are happening and we are doing them. There's some kind of a sense of responsibility, including moral responsibility, for things out there and for ourselves as well. It's the main quality of the human world. But later on, Buddhism realised that the 6 vijnanas, the 6 awarenesses, didn't express this. They just express simple awareness, just simple sounds, simple sights. simple perceptions. So the later forms of Buddhism took on this problem. They came up with two more. One that included this kind of self-consciousness, and another that included the whole realm of memory. And they added these two on top of the basic 6. So you had 8 functionings of consciousness, you could put it like that. So just want to recap. There's all the moments of simple awareness that we experience: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and perceiving, simple mentally perceiving. Then these moments of self-consciousness, the later Buddhists call distorted or defiled mind consciousness. That is, there's something added onto the simple mental consciousness of something which somehow distorts it. And that distortion is caused by the idea that I am aware of it. It slightly distorts it, which is interesting. So adding in awareness of self makes our simple awareness of things in the world a lot more complicated. Or you could say a lot richer. It's another way of putting it. It adds in many other dimensions to our ordinary awareness of people, trees, grass, food, thoughts, houses, cars. People become, through this process, people become our kind of people. They're not just people, they're our kind of people, or not our kind of people. Trees and grass and the rest of the natural world become important or unimportant because of how I can use them or how they affect me. So there's a difference, quite a huge difference in this kind of awareness. Food, houses, cars and material goods now start to affect me. I want or I do not want them. I hate them. I love them. I worry about them. I dread them. I anticipate them. I assume something or other about them. I'm made disappointed by something or other about them. I become intoxicated by them. I can be depressed by them. This is all because of this self-awareness. So you can say it distorts it, but you can also say it brings a lot of richness and a lot of life to it. But life is now really, really complicated. I'm no longer a simple amoeba-like creature. I have a very complex relationship with my world. And it's all happening around how we identify with some kind of sense of self. And then lastly, Buddhism added in, getting its list of 8 right, it added in what I earlier called, rather crudely, memory, to make this 8th consciousness called the store consciousness. It's the Alaya Vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness. It's an image. Alaya means a store. I think when they talk about the Himalaya mountains, I think the Alaya bit, I think the Himalaya is like the store of snow or something like that. Alaya means a store, and it's definitely a metaphor. If what it's referring to was literally a store, it would be ginormous, to use that word. It would be a very big one, because somehow it houses everything that has ever been received through any of the sense doors during our lifetime and previous lifetimes, whether we remember those things or not. Because memory has that quality. You don't do something to make yourself remember, you just happen to remember particular things. So in a sense, this metaphorical store consciousness, there's just every single impression that has ever come through the doors of the senses are somehow stored in there. This is quite a thing. It is all there, isn't it? Everything that's ever been a mental perception or a thought or a feeling. And all these instances are still there, somehow deep in our being, still there after all these years. Even though we can't remember things, they're kind of there, aren't they? Like seeds, they're like dormant seeds, that's how they're imagined. And sometimes these seeds, they get watered, sometimes by accident. These seeds get watered and suddenly they sprout up. They sprout up and they come up into memory. And this can be an amazing thing. It can be sometimes a very painful thing. It can be lots of things. Perhaps they're watered by meditation. Perhaps they're triggered by some idea that we read. Or maybe they're triggered by a meeting with somebody. Something happens. Perhaps they're just something that comes into our lives. And usually we just don't know why they have appeared, or indeed what they are. In fact, we don't usually notice any of this happening, actually. Often seeds from the storehouse consciousness come up in dreams, which we may or may not be aware of. And yet they happen. So this memory store is seen as a kind of awareness or a kind of consciousness. It's a manner of awareness. It's a way that awareness functions in relation to self. Awareness relates to impressions from the past, which are like sleeping seeds that can be woken up. So let's try to recognize in our experience how this all works together, because it's happening, isn't it, all the time. A moment of simple consciousness provided by the senses interacts with our current sense of self, of being a separate individual. Maybe it's something we see and it's not a pleasant experience. Or that seed goes straight into memory and we're subtly changed even by holding the seed. You have all the senses receiving impressions like that, and they're getting stored in memory all the time. There's a whole response system reacts to these impressions. And those reactions are very strongly affected by the idea that I am somehow involved. If that sense of identification with I is very, very intense, there are likely to be emotions like anger, hatred, craving, strong need, or panic and confusion, where there's a strong identification with I. Where that sense of identification is less intense, where it's a bit more relaxed, maybe a bit less self-conscious, put it like that, you likely get more spacious, generous emotions like curiosity, patience, and compassion, just to name 3. So that's the first 2 levels of awareness that we all experience. I'm just trying to describe something that happens in all of us. Simple awareness and this far more complex self-awareness. They are really, really quite distinct. And then there's this 3rd level, which is also quite clearly distinct. And this is what Sangharakshita once called transcendental awareness. I don't really go with this term, but let's use it for now. We can call it many things, but what's special about it is this is wisdom. This or enlightened or awakened awareness. So this is when insight arises, and from that point on in the person's life, the manner of awareness is not conditioned by deluded assumptions of self, or of some kind of permanence somewhere, or something like that. There's a collapse of that kind of illusion or delusion. So this is what starts to arise at the stage we sometimes call spiritual death, when under the pressure of the practices many of us are doing, there is a collapse of wrong views. This can happen in little ways, it can happen in very big ways. In particular, the wrong view of self, or the distorted view of self. Illusion collapses, and that's always a big surprise. It's always a big surprise. Because suddenly a whole lot of things we took for granted are revealed not even to be there. There's always a big surprise. You don't know what it is that you're, holding on to, as it were. So from this point, there's a whole process of insight management. You could put it like that. You could even, because this can be quite a challenge. You introduce this element into your own life, and because it's an unknown dimension of things, there's a bit of management to do of one's existence, as it were. I think that's for another talk. It's a really interesting topic. But what concerns us is the wisdom awareness that you notice at this point is something surprisingly fresh and new. And the word for it is jnana, J-N-A-N-A, jnana or jnana. And the word used for the other two levels, if you remember, is vijnana or vijnana, right? So the word with the vijnana, with the jnana, there's no vi. There's no vi bit. It's either vijnana or jnana. And this prefix vi suggests divided. I think you even may get it in the English word divided. So, and it's in the vijnana, in the awareness in our everyday experience, in the simple awareness or the self-awareness, there's always a division between the perceiving subject and the object that is experienced out there, like the sound, for example. But when we step into jnana, both perceived and the perceiver are united in a single moment of awareness. The two are no longer separate. It becomes really obvious that there's no real distinction between the two. We assume there's a distinction, but it becomes obvious that there is no real distinction that can be made. You can't find the boundary, as it were. And once that has been seen, or once you start to see that, one no longer expects to find that kind of separation. And I think it's a big, the snowball starts to accumulate more snow, as it were. The realization dawns that the world that appears to us all, in every moment of perception, throughout the day and the night, is a mutually dependent reality. And it never was actually a separate world independent of a perceiving subject. It simply isn't like that. And it's not something anyone can explain. It can only be known in experience. Obviously, it's of its nature. So that's jnana. The four Buddhas each have a jnana. There's the Akshobhya jnana, the Ratnasambhava jnana, the Amitabha jnana, and the Amoghasiddhi jnana. But again, that's another talk. I'm mostly finished now. There's just a couple of aspects of awareness I need to mention just to complete the picture. And the first is the jhanas. I guess a lot of you know the jhanas are states of very, very deep meditation experience, and it's something people often talk about. And they're definitely modes of awareness. And quite a few of you probably know these a bit, have some acquaintance with the jhanas. Not the jnanas, but the jhanas. The dhyanas, right? They're meditative states that come about through deep meditation. But they're also ways of talking about more integrated and, as it were, higher, to use that word, states of awareness or consciousness. I don't want to there's no time to discuss these in details, but it's worth clarifying that in terms of the framework I've been using, simple, self and awakened awareness, these jhana states are rather special kinds of self-awareness. They fit in that middle category. There's still, in the jhanas, there's still some kind of motivation that's based on a real belief that the self is something real and solid. That belief is still there. Maybe quite subtle, maybe quite attenuated, may not be a big issue, but we still imagine the self is really solidly there as a thing, as it were. And so we still are making it a central reference point in our lives, even though we might be in some amazing jhana state, right? Okay, the other aspect I wanted to talk about, and I wish I had time to spend a whole talk on this, which is visionary awareness. It's just this whole world of vision. When we start getting near the borderline of transcendental awareness, when our fixed views start to fall away, for whatever reason, and there can be lots of reasons why our fixed views start falling away, when this starts happening, the way we see things starts changing, and things can start happening that we don't expect. And I think it's also helpful to spend time in nature. I mean, I wouldn't mind betting that those of you who've been here a few days, you're having more intense dream life. Or maybe you're actually noticing that you have dreams, more intense, and even some interesting daydreams. It might depend on all kinds of factors, right? But, those things are happening. And I don't know if you were in the Dakini Puja last night, but after night's puja, I had lots of Dakinis, wisdom goddesses coming into my meditation. Just these images of these wisdom goddesses. And, I don't know what that means either, but it's visionary. A vision is like a waking dream. And it's a mode of awareness that you can sort of switch into. And it's also meaningful. It's meaningful. I don't know what it means, but it's meaningful. Or a vision is also like a waking dream or a dream within a dream. It has that quality. So I could have said more about the waking awareness and the dreaming awareness and even the dying awareness. There's lots to be said about these aspects of awareness as well. But that also comes under the three levels I've been explaining. That's a kind of good catch-all. In vision, something completely new comes into awareness. And it has some kind of message that's completely beyond what we expected. And we may not be able to understand what the message is as well. And what's important is not the message so much as the happening itself. That's what's important. Sometimes the vision entails somebody speaking to us. Sometimes it's just an image. You just see a person, usually often a person or a face or something like that. Or it could be an animal, or it could be a world, some kind of image that strikes us so strongly we can't forget it for quite a few hours afterwards. Something we'd never ever seen or imagined before. And there's a famous story in one of the Mahayana sutras where someone has a problem, has a spiritual problem of some kind, something about the nature of things, and they are kind of preoccupied by it. They're a bit obsessed by it. Some people can't stop thinking about how much suffering there is in the world, for example, some very spiritual people, or how much unkindness there is in the world, or how much indifference there is in the world. Or they might have this problem: how can I think of transforming myself when there's so much suffering in the world? These are real issues for quite a lot of people. And it can hold things up, or it's something that you can't stop thinking about. Anyway, they think about it and they think about it. They think about it in the day, they think about it in the night. And one day something happens just out of the blue. Just happens out of the blue. They have a vision. They have a vision. And the four Buddhas appear out of the sound of a golden drum hanging in the sky. This was the vision. And these Buddhas speak. Well, they say something. Maybe he or she couldn't even remember exactly what they said, but the vision and what was said somehow changes the problem. It's no longer a problem in some way. That's the quality of visionary awareness. It takes many forms. It can be big or it can be small. I think it's there as a potential all of the time. If you know how to read the signs, if you had some sort of introduction to it, there are shamanic ways into it, there are meditative ways into it, there are oracles, some people are into astrology and stuff like that, and the arts. I think the arts actually is a way into this kind of liminal awareness. I can't say more, but because this isn't that kind of talk. And also I'm pretty much at the end of my talk. I've been telling you about what awareness is, at least how it's seen in the Buddhist tradition, how it's imagined in the Buddhist tradition. And I hope you've been able to notice much of what I've been pointing to in your own experience. In many ways it's all simply a matter, as I've said a few times, of looking more closely at the awareness we already have, because all of this is already there. Awareness is something very, very simple. It's just objects being perceived, or more simply, objects manifesting. And that happens in 6 ways: through ears, eyes, noses, tongues, bodies and minds. Then much of the time it's self-awareness or reflective awareness as well, because there's a sense of an independent self involved. And that involves certain distortions, and there's also the strangeness of memory that comes into it. So we get a total of these 8 awarenesses. I'm just recapping now. Then finally, when insight arises, and perhaps with some kind of visionary component involved in that, because there often is, all 8 of these kinds of awareness become totally transformed, and they all become wisdoms. So that's it.